from Brandeis University and also our domestic spaces. Welcome to Recall This Book. Today it's my great pleasure to invite a guest, Shaun Hill. Welcome, Shaun. And a co-host, Liz Bradfield from Brandeis University. And we're going to be having a conversation about Shaun's poetry and related pathways and channels. First, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Bradfield, our distinguished co-host for today. Liz is the author of several books of poetry, including her most recent book, Theorem, in collaboration with the artist Antonio Contro. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of Broadsided Press, a monthly broadside publisher, and she teaches poetry at Brandeis. So just to introduce Shaun to you, he's the author of two poetry collections, Dangerous Goods, which was awarded the Minnesota Book Award in Poetry from 2014, and Blood Ties and Brown Liquor, named one of the 10 books all Georgians should read in 2015. I presume that's the state of Georgia, not the nation, although I'm sure the people in the nation of Georgia should also read it. He's received numerous awards, including fellowships from Cave Canem, the Region 2 Arts Council, Minnesota State Arts Board, Jerome Foundation, and many other honors. He's served as the director of the Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference at Bemidji State University, and he's also a consulting editor at Broadsided Press, a monthly broadside publisher. So we thought it would be great, Shaun, if we might start off by having you read a poem.
Okay, I would love to. I was kind of torn between which poems to read. A couple picked out. I think I'm going to read a new poem, one that's not in a book yet, but hopefully will be soon. The title is Musica Universalis in Fairbanks. Musica Universalis in Fairbanks. Each night, this 21st century frontier town settles enough for me to hear the thrum and hiss in my ears, my tinnitus, which I choose to think of as the harmony of my firmament, all so far away, like the whoosh and hiss from Nana's gas heater that warmed the winter-chilled bedroom in Georgia while she got the skillet sizzling with country-cured ham in the kitchen. My refrigerator occasionally wakes this hour to clear its throat and rumble on over the sounds in my ears. And some nights I get out of bed to go stand under the generosity of stars here. I've decided that must be the collective noun for all the stars in one's gaze, as it must also be for any number of scars. The way we refer to a flock of starlings as a murmuration. I stand there and use my hand to shade my eyes from the streetlights to better see the stars. Our new light competes with the old. The way the clamor of fleets in the age after sails is said to interfere with the songs of whales. Here, I sometimes see the aurora borealis, silent, which seems impossible, like the end of the world for what we know of light in the sky, lightning, and its often not far off companion, thunder, seems to say something will always follow. Some say the northern lights sizzle, an impossibility, a synesthetic weaving of the senses exalting this light, or a lark like the bird, which we call an exaltation when in numbers great or small. More than a handful, the way a friend used to count lovers when we were younger, told me he was on to the second hand. Love, while a lark, still handled carefully in those days. I should drive out of town to view these lights against the sky black as a raven. They often fly in pairs or groups, a conspiracy, a storytelling, an unkindness of ravens.
It's so great to hear a new poem from you, Shaun. And I don't know, what I always love about your poems is the way that they interweave in conversation with themselves, the way that they evolve, the way that they morph from one thing into another, and reconnect and offer these surprising juxtapositions. Um, the way, for example, we went from the lark to the hand, um, to the raven. Yeah, it's such beautiful work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, that's what the language offers. And, I don't know. I keep sort of trying to think about how we think about ecosystems and the planet, the things that get moved around. And you're sort of taking me away, like thinking about how we think about things, like
Uh-huh.
the the house sparrow. Correct me if I'm wrong, Liz, but that is also a non-native species, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And we don't think about them generally the same way as we think about sparrows. At least they don't get sort of broadly in the culture the same kind of bad rap. And actually, right now, I have some house sparrows nesting in a birdhouse
Hmm.
on our garage. I saw the starlings. Like my wife was like, "Oh, there's a cute little brown bird out there." I was like, "It's a non-native invasive species." But
Right.
also, like, it is a cute little brown bird. And then the starlings were coming around, like trying to peek and see what's happening in there. And it's like this moment of like, well, how do I think about the starlings in this moment, right? Um,
Hmm.
they're trying to get by. Um, and again, I'm kind of curious. Like, I don't have a poem about the house sparrow, but I'm like, that feels like a space to like think about like how we um, think about other and othering each other, right?
Hmm.
Um, so
And I think this is in your poems too, but and of movement and who gets to move and what's the impetus to move. Um, in some cases of animals shifting ranges, it's not through the deliberate introduction of something like it was with the starlings. Sometimes it's range expansion in relation to climate change, so that's
right,
kind of tied to us. I don't know. It's
right,
yeah, that idea of migration, shifting patterns,
right.
where it's natural, big air
Mm.
quotes, and where it's unnatural. And then in your work, how much that ties to human movements as well, which is super
Yeah.
Yeah,
interesting to me.
yeah. You're there's the eruption of pine siskins like this year, right? Um, and we get those things that happen every now and again. And what does that have to do with like our action, like climate change that we have had some hand in, right? Um, yeah, those are questions I worry, not necessarily on the page, but they're in my head like a lot of the time.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, who gets to move?
I mean, can you talk a little bit about that Dear America letter?
Yeah, I was asked to take part of this epistolary project, right? Like write a letter to America. I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And it came out of them like, oh, we really like these postcard poems. Can you write something like that? And I was like, maybe, let me see. And no, I couldn't. I think I had too much space that I needed to fill, and it was too big. Like writing a postcard to America didn't seem doable to me in the time. And I had this trip coming up with my dad, and so I felt like that was it gave me the opportunity to think, and I was sort of taking notes about our travel. And travel for me, it gives me perspective to sort of reflect and sort of pull back and sort of see where I am in like physical space, but also in political space. Um, so the essay is about driving like 4 days across Canada with my dad, which was once in a lifetime trip. I don't know that we've ever spent 4 days together, just the two of us, like you know, in our lives before that. Um, and I've always had problems with border crossings, and just like then also when you talk about having problems with border crossings, you have to think about what a border is. And just sort of physically be on, like stand on the border, the straddle these, the line that bisects demarcates the nations. Um, And it just made me think about like what is it that is being kept on either side of the line. Um, and also it just I writing an essay that's a travel log, I got to like, focus on nature and scenery and those things. So it was really kind of a cool project that felt like, I could get at these, ways in which our lives are bounded. And I think there were these moments in it with my father, who was born and raised in Milledgeville, Georgia, and has spent much of his life there. Um, Sort of getting him as far away from Milledgeville as I think he'd ever been, um, and taking this slow trip with me, um, like allowed him to see some things and allowed me to see some things about him. And then, we in the car for 4 days and sort of ask questions about like how his life had been um, bounded. He was born in the 40s, late 40s, and so like he grew up with Jim Crow, and so I wanted to ask about that, but I didn't want to ask too directly about that. So I asked this question about um, what was the big change in your life, your lifetime, that
Yeah.
this sort of societal shift, this thing had happened, and there are lots of them, and so he's like, cell phone, radio, communication. I was like, I don't know what to do with that, Dad. Like, there was a period when like you were not an equal citizen, and then you are. And he's like, oh yeah, that happened too. And so
Right.
like just sort of thinking about ways in which we sort of normalize things, internalize things, and how we do view our lives was kind of interesting for me. um yeah.
There's something that I thought was really intriguing about that essay, because it sort of had the form of a certain kind of genre, right? Of this sort of travel narrative and reflection. But it was doubled because it was you and your father. And there are these moments in it, and that was one of them that you just described, where sort of your expectation of what he's going to say is kind of confounded, and then kind of doubles back, and you sort of, you know, have more conversation about it. But there's all these moments, like the scene in the motel where, I mean, I'm describing it as a scene because it has this sort of cinematic quality, but where your responses and his responses are kind of set side by side, and that but not necessarily always in the same way, that certain things that feel like threats to him don't to you, and then do. And that also seemed really important to put in a letter about America, right? From outside of America. And I just thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean that's part of the work too. I'm thinking about ways in which our lives are bounded by our lifetimes, and the our context, right? Like, my South is different from his South. My experience was
Yeah.
different, and part of that had to do with like how they raised me. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think I was listening I listen to too much radio sometimes. I was listening to a show and they were talking about sort of the immigrant experience and the first generation, second generation, and how like parents are trying to shape the the life of the child, like what they tell the child and what they don't. And like my parents didn't really talk too directly about segregation. I think they
Mm-hmm.
didn't really want to like, I think, burden me maybe with that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I grew up in a recently desegregated South, not really understanding how it had affected them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a direct way. I mean, I could see it on like the edges of it, and like the way that they were around white people, and how they observed me with white people, um, and what they sort of like expected to happen, and how they were like encouraging of like, oh, we go talk to these people. But that fascinates me. And also because now I have a son, I'm like thinking about like how his world, his, America is going to be different from my America. I don't know exactly
Mm-hmm.
how, but it will probably be, it has to be, it can't be, that's the generational bounding of our lives, right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, those things sort of fascinate me, and I think that's part of the essay too that I don't really sort of get at too much, but it's there. I think there's like a follow-up essay actually they're
Oh,
working on
okay.
that sort of touches
Mm,
on those things. But like, yeah, like how
right.
do we?
Well, but it's yeah, it seems like it's in there, and it's sort of not only that your past and his past are different, but that makes your presence different too,
Right,
right? You're on two different trips
right,
because of that, even though you're also on the same trip.
right. And and also,
Yeah.
yeah, it's two different trips because of the past, but also uh, I guess this is technically speaking part of the past, but like I traveled much more than he had. I'd been to
Right.
Canada.
Hmm.
I I took my dad and my mom to Canada once because we lived up in northern Minnesota, and my mom's like, "I want to go to Canada," and so they came up for a visit, and we went across the border and like spent the night in Winnipeg, and I think it was interesting and strange. They had Indian food for the first time in their lives, and for the last time. Um, and as soon as we got back across the border, we stopped at a cafe, as they say in Minnesota, a cafe. And my dad was like trying to order Southern food. And I was like, they don't like, there was a waitress, it was her first day on the job. And she was like, I don't understand sweet tea. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, this is like way northern Minnesota. And she's just like, she had to call the manager over to sort of, I'm like, oh my God. Yeah. Um,
Moments with one's parents.
yeah,
But I wanted to ask you about influence in your work or other books and writers that have shaped you in the ways that you've approached some of these poems that we've talked about today, or that feel like they're a current kind of feeding your practice. Um, yeah, who would they
yeah.
be?
Um, there's this book by C.S. Giscombe, um, titled Into and Out of Dislocation. Giscombe's known as a poet, but this is kind of a memoir, uh, book of prose, um, also travel log too. And I got this book right before I moved to northern Minnesota, and there's just like some of the parallels, and ways of thinking that he was doing in this book influenced Dangerous Goods. Like one of the sort of things is just like he was into riding his bicycle, and he had these rules for riding his bike. And so I was like, I'm gonna ride my bike. I need to ride my bike. I need to get out. And so it was like it got me out of nature, and like on these trails. Um, but he was in that book. He was looking for um, a possible ancestor. Um, so he talks about sort of his um, growing up African American, um, also losing an arm at a young age to an accident. There's all these things that are happening, but at some point he's like, he's as an adult, as a writer, um, thinking about, you know, a project. He finds this guy, John Giscombe, who was a Jamaican pioneer in BC. So a Jamaican in British Columbia who like is like making a name for himself. And there's there are landmarks named for this guy. And he's like, maybe this is an ancestor.
I know him. I know Giscombe because of Giscombe Road, the book of poems he wrote about this investigation. And now I'm super curious to read the prose as a follow up and what kind of um, how that refracts the poetry.
Yeah, no, yeah, and you will love it, I think. Yeah, and so him thinking about Giscombe, John Giscombe, sort of got me in the mind of thinking about the people that come before, right? I think there's a way in which I do that work, sort of in a community in Blood Ties and Brown Liquor, and I think about family and try to sort of do that some of that work, but moving to Bemidji, Minnesota, I was like, who was here before me? And I was just kind of, I think I was thinking actually just musing about it without thinking about it too hard at the time, and just kind of happenstance came across mention in a flyer of a lecture about this guy named George Bonga, who was an Afro-Ojibwe voyageur.
Mm.
So like that's like three things right there, right? or one thing, right? Um, and I was really excited about him, and I couldn't wait the 2 weeks for the lecture. So I went to the Historical Society in Bemidji, Minnesota, and was like, I need whatever information you guys have on George Bonga. They're like, we don't know this guy, but we have a file on this other guy. Since you're interested in African Americans, you know, in Bemidji history. And so, yeah, they introduced me to this guy, Charles W. Scrutcheon, who was a lawyer who moved to Bemidji in 1898, 99.
I love that Scratchin poem.
Thank you. And so, yeah, at some point for me, like him looking for ancestors made me think about like thinking about the ancestors, right? Like made me think that I need to like figure out who was here before me as a way to see how I fit. And it's kind of a comfort too. And I feel like now that's part of my project is understanding the narrative because, you know, we talk about representation a lot, like, oh, you need to see people like you to think about how to be. And I think there's truth in that. And so like me looking to see like, okay, these are people who are in some way like me, who are here. I'm not the first. And I don't need to be the first. It's actually really good to know that I'm not the first.
Lonely to be the first, right?
Hmm?
A little
Yeah.
lonely to be the first.
I mean, it's lonely enough being the only, right? Or one of the few.
Right.
But like to sort of reclaim the narrative and like, well, we were here, I think is important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sort of in terms of who represents me, I'm thinking about like because of the way race is constructed in this country, I'm a Black man and I identify that way. And so when I identify other Black people who who've preceded me in a space, in a place, it's comforting. It's like I'm like I know I can be here. Um, I don't know if everyone else knows I can be here, but I know I can be here. If that makes sense.
Right.
So yeah, then that's kind of the project that I'm working on now is thinking about that.
I mean, I know your new writing is taking you back to Georgia as well and into history. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the Georgia history I'm looking at is actually around the governor's mansion as a place, but also the administration of Joseph Emerson Brown, who was the governor of Georgia right before and during the Civil War. So he was elected and came into office in 1858 and just kind of was there through the Civil War. And I'm interested in someone governing during that period, and also the fact that there were Black lives that were part of that administration. At the time, the governor's mansion, there was no household staff that was like a permanent staff part of the governor's mansion. There wasn't money appropriated for that. The governors brought their slaves with them to serve them and be the servants of the governor's mansion. Things came up, life happens, but I was like, I'm not going to leave this project because it feels, yeah, more relevant, differently relevant, like in this way, which once Trump was elected, I was like, okay, now we have a different way to think about this. And then January 6th shifted it again because, in I guess 2019, I think it was, I was doing more research on this project. I was like, oh, I got to go find these things. I need to find, so there were some pieces I really want to dig around and look for. And in that digging, more things came up, and I found Governor Brown's letter in which he sort of, because all of the Confederates had to be pardoned, and they had to make this oath they wouldn't commit treason again, and like they were traitors, and there's paperwork, and I have like copies and photographs of the paperwork, and I was like, okay, this is gonna work its way in somehow because it felt important, and then like January 6th happens, like a year and a half later, and I'm like, okay, I really need to get this thing out. um, yeah.
Before more sedition happens.
Right. Um, so yeah, those things like these moments you have in the archives in the library with the research. You're like, oh yes, and then like there's this other energy that is needed to make something of that. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, one of these days, and I was thinking about that project and the Civil War is also like one sort of step toward my exploration of um, you know westward migration. So I'm interested in like we have a lot about the Great Migration to the north, but I'm like there's people, Black folk went west too, and so that's another part of the project. Thinking about Black people in the West post Civil War.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and I'm in the West. So again, it's like this sort of idea of like trying to figure out like what are the parallels, where's the representation, who were the people, how did they do it?
Bodies in space and time.
Bodies in space and time.
Yeah.
So I'm supposed to be writing poems about um, Montana history, Black folk in Montana history. That's my next project. But I also have other places I want to write about in the West. And there's Captain Healy. That's another strand, another thread of the westward research. Michael A. Healy, Michael Augustine Healy, was captain of the revenue cutters in the sort of the federal authority in Alaska during the last couple of decades of the 19th century. But he was born to an Irish immigrant father who was a planter, and one of his father's slaves, who his father seemed to take as his common law wife. They had 10 children together, all of which he sent north to be out of slavery. But he was born in 1839, and not too far from where I was born, And so I was sort of thinking about that, like, oh, this guy was born a county over, had this trajectory. He ended up in Alaska and being a famous hero of the time to some.
Named after him.
Town's named after him. Yeah, town's named that's how he was introduced to me, actually. Because I have a question I ask when I go places, like, where are the books about Black people? Is there a plaque about Black people that were here? Tell me about the Black people who were here. So I never walk in thinking I'm the first Black person. So I was like, there has to be somebody. And the woman was like, well, Captain Healy was Black at the gift shop at Denali. She's like, who? She's like, the town, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay.
For people who don't know, Healy is the town that's just adjacent to Denali National Park. It's a very, very small town. It's a lot of people work in the park. It's a coal mining town also. There's a big coal operation there, but right smack dab in the middle of South Central Alaska.
Yeah. And so I started digging, and I was like, oh, we're like neighbors across centuries, kind of. Like, yeah.
So we do have a stage of many episodes where we talk about recallable books, so books that feel connected to the conversation that we've been having, and characteristically for me, one has come up in my mind in the course of our conversation. So maybe I'll just start off and then hear from you guys. This whole questions of movements of things that are human and more than human, and also the central north of the country. Makes me think of a book by Lorraine Niedecker called Lake Superior, which is the account of a trip that she took with her husband to Lake Superior, and it's about, a lot of it is about the rocks, which I'm very into rocks. So, but the rocks that also are now the bones of humans, the division between the rocks and the water and the humans is not where we always imagine it to be, or it isn't as firm as we imagine it to be, and that's really and in a sense, I see that in some of your poems and in our conversation. There's not so many rocks, but there's lots of birds, and there's also stars and senses and mountains, and so that's where that took me. So Sean, do you want to tell us a recallable book?
Invisible City by Italo Calvino. I'm thinking about him, like, we didn't really talk about cities so much, but I mean, it's part of it. But like in that book, like, so Kublai Khan is being reported to from Marco Polo about like the empire and different cities, and sort of you get these like little dispatches, like little, like, here's what this city is like, and they're really kind of very sensory but also kind of abstract, and it like ends up like, I read that book and it makes me think about the city and what cities are in this in what feels like a useful way, like that cities are things that aren't just always and just happened, or if they do, there is some design in them, like, nothing really just happens. And so and then how you can have some perspective on what is happening in a space, like in a community. What is the community? And so like I don't know, like I've had these thoughts when I've gone other places, and I think that book kind of helps me think about it. Like when I what used to be Barrow, now Uktiavik, Barrow, Alaska, now Uktiavik, Alaska. Yeah, I landed there, and one of the first things someone told me, like in the tour, because when you land there, if someone's picking you up, they're like, "You're going to get 4 tours of this place, at least 4 tours." And they're like, "Well, just pointing out places," and it's sort of like an igloo is the word for basically for domicile. So everybody lives in the igloos, whatever they look like. But then I was like thinking about, like, why do they look the way they look, right? Like, what is this imposition that feels more out of place than what was here before, which seemed like part of dealing with the environment, and the ways in which we don't deal with our environments anymore. At some point, we're just like, no, we're just bringing in this colonial sense of what a city should look like and feel like, and what the houses should be. I mean, I live in a really nice sort of big Victorian house, but I don't know why it's in Montana. I like it. Shouldn't necessarily be here though. So yeah, that book makes me think about cities and the things we get up to as a species when we get together in, I think, interesting ways.
Good, thanks. Liz?
Well, I'm a little torn. I've got a couple of books I'm recalling. I guess the first is the book Plain Water by Anne Carson, the poet and scholar, in part because it's about movement and journeying. It's about I'm assuming it's autobiographical, semi-autobiographical, about her trek along the Camino Real and her conversations over time. And as with a lot of her work, it's strange and cerebral, and then also kind of oddly passionate. And so when I think about your work, Sean, and the way that travel is also so full of desire often, and movement can be full of desire, whether it's like an intimate romantic desire or just curiosity and yearning. So I think about her book, also how it references and reaches to pull in all this different stuff. She's largely using the Haibun form in that book, which is a form I know you've used, Sean. In fact, I learned of the form from you. So I'm thinking about that book. And I'm also weirdly was thinking a little bit about The Ice Shirt, that novel. Have you read that, Sean? By William Bowman. It's such a weird book. I don't know that it's a perfect book. It's strange. It's about movement from Europe into Greenland in particular, and kind of looking at Vikings and encountering Inuit in Greenland and Canada. It's a strange, troubling royal of a book that gets a little fantastical and surreal, and I don't know why that one's coming to mind, but I think something about encounters and movement and an openness toward not quite a magical realism, but a strangeness that wants us to step out of ordinary time. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, I think our time has come to say thank you very much to Sean for joining us and for such a great conversation.
Yeah, Sean, thank you. You're so generous with your thought and time. And I wish we'd gotten to hear more poems, but I'm glad we got one poem from you.
Yes, yes, and a new one too is very exciting.
Thank you.
And I am going to tell our listeners about Recall This Book. Recall This Book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. It is recorded by Plotz, Ferry, and a cadre of other colleagues, including today our co-host, Elizabeth Bradfield, who are located in the Boston area and beyond. Our music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy called Fly Away. Sound editing is by Naomi Cohen, and production assistance, including website design and social media, is done by Nai Kim. We are grateful to Mark DeLillo for his consultation on tech matters, and we appreciate the support of University Librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean Dorothy Hodgson, and of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. You can email us directly or contact us via social media and our website. If you enjoyed today's show, please write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may be interested in checking out past episodes, such as Lisa Dillman on translation, and David Ferry and Roger Reeves on the underworld in poetry. Thanks to all of you, and we'll see you next time.